The sound of her body hitting the frozen mud echoed through the silent street like a gunshot. Eliza Rowan had traveled 2,000 miles to become a bride, only to be beaten like an animal in front of an entire town that did nothing. The man who paid for her passage stood over her broken form, his boot raised for another kick. She was dying in the dirt, abandoned by everyone, until a scarred stranger with ice-blue eyes stepped from the shadows and changed everything. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust and horse sweat, and Eliza Rowan's hands trembled as she gripped the worn leather of her traveling bag. Through the small window, she could see Dry Creek for the first time, a collection of weathered buildings squatting in the shadow of distant mountains, their peaks still white with early winter snow. The town looked harder than she'd imagined, more unforgiving, but then again, she'd left behind something far worse. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice rough with road dust and indifference. Eliza stepped carefully from the coach, her legs unsteady after 3 days of constant jostling. The November wind cut through her threadbare coat like it wasn't even there, and she pulled it tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how inadequate her Eastern clothing was for this harsh landscape. Her fingers found the letter in her pocket. The one she'd read so many times, the creases had begun to tear. "Respectable rancher seeks wife. Room, board, and protection guaranteed. Passage paid. Protection." That single word had been enough to make her say yes to a man she'd never met. The street was busy with afternoon traffic, wagons rolling past, men on horseback, women with baskets hurrying between shops. But as Eliza stood there beside her single bag, she felt every eye turn toward her. The new mail-order bride, fresh merchandise delivered right to the town's doorstep. "You Eliza Rowan?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough-edged. She turned to find a man approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive coat that didn't quite hide the cruelty in his bearing. His face was handsome in a hard way, with dark hair and darker eyes that looked her up and down like she was a horse he was considering purchasing. "Mr. Pike?" she asked, trying to keep the uncertainty from her voice. "Harlan Pike." He didn't offer his hand, didn't smile. "You're smaller than I expected, and older." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was 23, hardly ancient, but she'd learned long ago that honesty in a mail-order bride advertisement was a gamble. She'd added 2 years to her youth and subtracted 10 pounds from her weight. Looking at Pike's expression now, she wondered if she should have lied more. The advertisement didn't specify. Advertisement said young and healthy. He circled her slowly, and Eliza's skin crawled. "You look half-starved. Can you work?" "I'm a seamstress, Mr. Pike. I can sew, cook, clean." "I asked if you can work." His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard enough to make her gasp. He turned her hand over, examining her fingers. "These are soft. City hands. Useless hands." Eliza tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Mr. Pike, you're hurting me." "Am I?" He smiled then, and it was the coldest expression Eliza had ever seen. "Well, you better get used to a little hurt, girl. Ranch life ain't gentle." He released her so suddenly she stumbled backward. The watching townspeople had grown quiet, their conversations dying away one by one. Eliza looked around desperately, searching for a friendly face, someone who might intervene. But every gaze that met hers slid away, suddenly fascinated with storefronts or the dirt at their feet. "Get your bag," Pike ordered. "Wagons down the street." Eliza bent to retrieve her traveling bag, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. But what choice did she have? She'd spent her last dollar on the train fare east to the stagecoach station. She had no money, no way back, nowhere to go even if she could get there. Her fingers had just closed around the bag's handle when Pike's voice cut through the air again. "And Eliza? One more thing." She straightened, turning to face him. "Yes, Mr." The blow came out of nowhere. Pike's open hand caught her across the face with enough force to spin her completely around. She heard a woman gasp somewhere in the crowd, heard the sharp crack of palm against cheekbone echo off the buildings. Then she was falling, the world tilting sideways as her knees hit the boardwalk. "That's for lying in your letter," Pike said calmly, standing over her. "Said you were 21. Found the truth from the stagecoach manifest. Don't much appreciate being deceived. Eliza's face felt like it was on fire. She could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Pike's boots on the wooden planks as he stepped closer. "Mr. Pike, please." She tried to raise her hands defensively, but he was already reaching down. He grabbed a handful of her hair and hauled her to her feet. Eliza cried out, her scalp burning, tears springing to her eyes. She could see the townspeople now, frozen in their places, watching. A woman with a basket held her hand over her mouth. A man in a shopkeeper's apron stood in his doorway, his face carefully blank. Two cowboys sat on their horses, their expressions amused. No one moved to help her. "I paid good money for your passage," Pike said, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. $40 for the train, another 20 for the stage. That makes you mine, you understand? I own you." "You don't own me," Eliza gasped, the words torn from her before she could stop them. "I'm not property. I'm a human being." For a moment, Pike just stared at her. Then he laughed, a sound without humor or warmth. "A human being," he repeated. "You hear that, boys?" He raised his voice, addressing the watching crowd. "This little city mouse thinks she's a human being." Someone laughed. Eliza couldn't see who through the tears blurring her vision. Pike's grip on her hair tightened, and he began dragging her toward the edge of the boardwalk. "Let me explain something to you about how things work out here. You got on that stagecoach. You accepted my terms. The law sees it the same as a contract. You're my wife in everything but the church ceremony, and that's just a formality we'll get to when I feel like it." "No," Eliza managed, trying to find her footing, trying to resist. That can't be." They reached the steps leading down to the street, and Pike shoved her hard. Eliza tumbled down the 3 wooden steps and landed in the half-frozen mud of the main road. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. She lay there gasping, tasting dirt and blood, her dress soaked with icy water. Above her, Pike descended the steps with leisurely confidence. "You got 2 choices, girl. You can get up, get in my wagon, and learn to be grateful for the roof I'm putting over your head. Or," he pulled back his boot, "or I can make sure you don't get up at all." Eliza tried to roll away, but her dress was tangled around her legs, heavy with mud. She saw the boot coming, saw the cruel certainty in Pike's eyes, and she knew with absolute clarity that no one was going to stop this. The entire town was watching her die, and not a single soul was going to lift a finger to help. The boot swung toward her ribs and stopped. A hand had caught Pike's ankle in mid-swing, gripping it with such force that the rancher staggered, his balance suddenly gone. Pike twisted, his face contorting with rage, and found himself staring up at a man who seemed to have materialized from nowhere. He was enormous. Not just tall, Eliza had seen tall men before, but broad and solid as an oak tree, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin coat. His hair was long and dark, shot through with gray, pulled back from a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. Scars traced white lines across his weathered skin, one running from his temple to his jaw, another crossing his forehead, a third disappearing into the collar of his shirt. But it was his eyes that held Eliza frozen where she lay in the mud. They were blue, not the friendly blue of a summer sky, but the cold, pale blue of ice over deep water. "Let go of me," Pike snarled, trying to yank his leg free. The stranger's expression didn't change. He simply opened his hand, releasing Pike's ankle. The rancher stumbled backward, barely catching himself. "You got no business here, Boone," Pike said, his hand moving toward his hip, toward the pistol holstered there. "This is between me and my wife." "She's not your wife." The stranger's voice was quiet, but it carried, deep and rough, like rock grinding against rock. "She's a woman you're beating in the street." "I paid for her passage. That makes her—" "Nothing." Boone took a step forward, and despite his size, he moved with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. "Don't make her anything." Pike's hand was on his pistol now, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "You threatening me, mountain man? You know who I am?" "Know what you are?" The 2 men faced each other in the muddy street, and the tension was so thick Eliza could feel it pressing down on her chest. Around them, the townspeople had gone completely silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the danger, shifting nervously in their traces. Pike's fingers tightened on his pistol grip. I could shoot you where you stand. Sheriff wouldn't say a word about it. Could try. Boone's right hand hung loose at his side, nowhere near a weapon. But something in his absolute stillness suggested he didn't need to be fast. Won't end the way you think. For a long moment, nothing moved. Eliza held her breath, certain that bullets were about to fly. But then Pike's hand slowly moved away from his gun. His face twisted with barely contained rage, but behind it, Eliza saw something else. Something that looked almost like fear. This ain't over, Pike said, his voice tight. Not by a long shot. That woman owes me $60, and I mean to collect. Send me a bill. Pike's laugh was sharp and bitter. You got $60, Boone? You got $2? Everyone knows you're half wild yourself, living up in those mountains like an animal. You can barely afford powder for that old rifle. Boone didn't respond to the insult. Instead, he turned his back on Pike, a gesture of such profound dismissal that the rancher actually flinched and walked toward where Eliza still lay in the mud. He was even bigger up close. Eliza found herself looking up at him the way she might look up at a cliff face, her neck craning back. His shadow fell over her, blocking out the weak afternoon sun, and every instinct screamed at her to scramble away. She'd just escaped one monster. How did she know this man wasn't worse? But then he crouched down, bringing himself closer to her level, and she saw his eyes again. They weren't cruel. They were careful, watchful. The eyes of a man who'd seen too much but hadn't forgotten how to be human. Can you stand? He asked. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. She tried to push herself up, but her arms were shaking too badly. The stranger, Boone, reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her arm with surprising gentleness and helped her to her feet. The world spun for a moment. Eliza swayed, and Boone's other hand came up to steady her, his massive palm against her back. Through the thin fabric of her dress, she could feel the warmth of his skin, so different from the cold of the mud, the cold of Pike's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Boone nodded once, then released her and turned to retrieve her traveling bag from where it had fallen. He brushed the mud from it with careful fingers, then held it out to her. Come with me, he said. It wasn't a request exactly, but it wasn't an order either, just a simple statement of fact, as if there was no other logical course of action. Eliza took the bag with trembling hands. She looked past Boone's shoulder to where Pike stood in the street, his face dark with fury. Then she looked around at the townspeople, at their carefully averted gazes and their cowardly silence. These people had watched her get beaten. They would watch her die if Pike came for her again. They would do nothing. You go with him. You're making a mistake, Pike called out. That man's a killer, girl. Ask anyone in this town. He'll use you up and leave you for the wolves. Eliza met Pike's eyes. Her face still throbbed where he'd hit her. She could still feel his fingers twisted in her hair. And she thought about the boot swinging toward her ribs, about the absolute certainty that he would have broken her bones and kept on breaking them until there was nothing left to break. I'll take my chances, she said. Pike's face went crimson. You walk away now. Don't you ever come back to this town. You hear me? You'll have nothing. No one. Boone was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance toward the edge of town. Eliza hurried after him, her legs unsteady, her dress heavy with mud and water. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see the faces of all those people who had watched and done nothing. They walked in silence past the last buildings, past the livery stable and the church with its white steeple, until Dry Creek was behind them and there was nothing ahead but wilderness. The mountains loomed larger here, their peaks sharp against the gray sky. The wind was getting stronger, colder, carrying with it the promise of snow. Eliza's teeth began to chat. The combination of wet clothes and dropping temperatures was dangerous, she knew that much. She'd heard stories about people freezing to death in weather that didn't seem that cold. But Boone kept walking, his pace never slowing, and she forced herself to keep up. After what felt like miles, but was probably less than one, they came to a place where a horse was tied to a pine tree. It was a huge beast, almost as intimidating as its owner. A dark bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. Beside it sat a travois made of long poles and leather straps, loaded with supplies. Boone untied the horse and gestured toward the travois. Sit. Storm's coming. Eliza looked at the sky. The clouds were definitely darker now, moving fast from the north. How far is your... Where are we going? Up? Boone nodded toward the mountains. 7 miles, maybe 8. 8 miles. In her current state, in these clothes, Eliza wasn't sure she could walk 80 feet. She sat down on the travois as instructed, pulling her knees up to conserve warmth. Boone took off his own coat, a heavy buckskin lined with fur, and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of wood smoke and leather. I can't take your coat, Eliza protested. You'll freeze. Boone was already moving, taking the horse's lead rope. No, I won't. And that was all he said. He started walking, the horse following obediently, and the travois began to slide across the ground with surprising smoothness. Eliza pulled the coat tighter around herself, feeling the first snowflakes beginning to fall. She should have been terrified. She was heading into the wilderness with a strange man, a man Pike had called a killer, wearing his coat completely at his mercy. Everything that had happened since stepping off that stagecoach had been a disaster, each choice worse than the last. But as the town disappeared behind them and the snow began to fall in earnest, Eliza found she wasn't afraid. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Or perhaps it was simply that after years of running from monsters, she'd finally learned to recognize when someone was trying to save her instead of hurt her. They climbed. The terrain grew steeper, the path narrower. The snow came down harder, whiting out the world until Eliza could barely see 10 feet ahead. But Boone never hesitated, never slowed. He walked with the confidence of a man who knew these mountains like other people knew their own homes. Eliza's face hurt. Her ribs ached where she'd fallen. Her hands were so cold she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. But the coat kept the worst of the chill at bay, and the steady motion of the travois was almost hypnotic. Her eyelids grew heavy. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, Boone was shaking her shoulder gently. We're here. Eliza blinked and looked around. Night had fallen completely, and the snow was coming down in sheets. But ahead, she could make out a dark shape against the mountainside. A cabin, solidly built, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. Boone helped her down from the travois, and her legs nearly buckled. He caught her without comment, his arm around her waist, half carrying her toward the cabin door. He kicked it open, and warmth rushed out to meet them. The interior was simple but clean. One large room with a fireplace at one end, a bed built into the wall, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. The fire was burning low, but it was burning, which meant Boone had known he'd be coming back here, had prepared for it. He guided Eliza to a chair near the fire and then busied himself with building up the flames. Within minutes, the cabin was growing genuinely warm. Eliza sat shivering, unable to do anything but stare at the fire and try to convince her body it was safe now. It could stop preparing for fight or flight. Boone filled a pot with snow from outside and hung it over the fire to melt. Then he pulled down a stack of blankets from a shelf and draped them over Eliza's shoulders, over the coat she was still wearing. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said, his back to her as he rummaged through a trunk. I'll step outside. There's a shirt and trousers here that might fit. Won't be pretty, but they're dry. He laid the clothes on the table and then, true to his word, walked out into the blizzard and shut the door behind him. Eliza sat there for a long moment, hardly believing it. Then with shaking fingers she began to undress. The wet fabric clung to her skin, and getting it off took longer than it should have. But finally she stood naked in the firelight, her skin puckered with goosebumps, her body a map of old bruises and new ones. She pulled on the shirt Boone had left. It was made of thick flannel and hung to her knees. The trousers were too large by far, but she rolled up the cuffs and cinched them tight with a leather belt. They were clean and dry and warm, and that was enough. You can come back in, she called. The door opened and Boone entered with an armful of firewood and a dusting of snow on his shoulders. He looked at her once, nodded approval, and went about stacking the wood by the fireplace. The water in the pot was boiling now, and he used it to make tea, real tea, not the chicory substitute she'd grown used to back east. He handed her a tin cup, and Eliza wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. She took a sip and nearly cried at how good it tasted. Boone settled into the other chair, his own cup in his hands, and for a while they just sat there in silence. Outside, the storm howled and shrieked, but inside the cabin it was warm and quiet and safe. Finally, Eliza found her voice. "Why did you help me?" Boone took a long drink of his tea before answering. "Because you needed help. Pike said you're a killer." "Pike says a lot of things." "Is it true?" Boone met her eyes, and there was no shame in his gaze, no apology. "I've killed men. When I had to. When they wouldn't be stopped any other way." Eliza should have been frightened by that admission. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. A man who admitted what he was seemed infinitely more trustworthy than one who lied about it. "What will happen when the storm ends?" she asked. "Pike won't just let this go." "No," Boone agreed. "He won't. But the pass will be snowed in for weeks, maybe months. By the time anyone can get up here, a lot can change." "What can change?" Boone stood and moved to the window, looking out at the white chaos beyond. "Everything," he said quietly. "Or nothing. Time will tell." Eliza wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what she'd gotten herself into, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. Her eyelids were so heavy, and the chair by the fire was so warm. "You take the bed," Boone said, as if reading her mind. "I'll sleep on the floor." "I can't take your bed," Eliza protested weakly. "You can. You will." He pulled several more blankets from the shelf and made himself a pallet on the floor near the door. "Sleep. We'll talk more tomorrow." Eliza stumbled to the bed, a simple frame with a rope mattress and thick quilts. She crawled under the covers, and it was like being wrapped in clouds. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Boone's silhouette against the firelight, sitting with his back to the door, a rifle across his knees, standing guard, protecting her. The last thought Eliza had before consciousness slipped away was that she'd escaped one kind of cage today, only to find herself in another. But this cage had warm blankets and hot tea and a man who'd faced down a monster to keep her safe. Maybe, she thought as she drifted off, some cages were meant to shelter rather than trap. Maybe some walls were built to keep dangers out rather than keep prisoners in. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who saw her as something worth protecting instead of something to be used. The storm raged on through the night, sealing the mountain pass, cutting them off from the world below. And in the warmth of the cabin, Eliza Rowan slept without nightmares for the first time in years, while a scarred mountain man kept watch over her in the darkness, as silent and steadfast as the mountains themselves. Outside, the snow piled higher and higher, burying the path they'd taken, erasing their tracks, creating a white wall between them and everything Eliza had left behind. By morning, Dry Creek might as well have been on another planet. By morning, there would be only the cabin, the mountains, and two strangers beginning the long, uncertain journey of learning whether trust could truly grow in the frozen soil of winter. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into hell, Eliza was safe. And for now, that was enough. Morning came late to the mountain, filtered through heavy clouds and falling snow. Eliza woke to the sound of a knife against wood. Steady, rhythmic, patient. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day crashed over her like cold water, and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. The cabin was warm despite the storm still raging outside. Boone sat at the table, working on something with his knife, his movements precise and unhurried. He glanced up when she stirred but didn't speak, just nodded once and returned to his carving. Eliza pushed back the quilts and stood, wincing as her bruised body protested. Her face felt swollen where Pike had struck her, and when she touched her cheek gingerly, the skin was hot and tender. "There's water heated," Boone said without looking up. "Basin's on the shelf, clean cloth next to it." Eliza found both where he'd indicated. The water was warm enough to steam slightly, and when she dipped the cloth in and pressed it to her face, she had to bite back a gasp. It hurt, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that meant healing rather than fresh damage. She cleaned herself as best she could, aware of Boone's presence but somehow not uncomfortable with it. He wasn't watching her, wasn't paying attention to her at all, really. He was just there, solid and steady, like one of the mountains themselves. When she finished, she turned to find him ladling something from a pot that hung over the fire. He filled 2 bowls and set them on the table. "Sit," he said. Eat. The stew was simple: venison, potatoes, onions, but it was hot and filling, and Eliza realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. She devoured her portion in minutes, then looked up to find Boone watching her with something that might have been amusement in his pale eyes. There's more, he said. She accepted a second helping, eating more slowly this time. Boone ate in silence across from her, his movements economical, his attention mostly on the window and the white chaos beyond. How long will the storm last? Eliza asked finally. 2 days? Maybe 3. He set down his spoon and looked at her directly. Pass won't be clear for weeks after that. Maybe not till spring. Spring. It was November now. That meant months trapped here, cut off from everything and everyone. Eliza should have felt panicked at the thought. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. I have questions, she said quietly. Expected you would. Why did you bring me here? Really? Boone was quiet for a long moment, his scarred fingers wrapped around his bowl. When he spoke, his voice was even rougher than usual. Because I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere left to run, and I know what Pike is, what he does to women. He met her eyes. Couldn't walk away from that. Pike called you a killer. Already told you that part's true. He said you're half wild, that you live up here like an animal. That part's true too. Boone stood and moved to the fireplace, adding another log. Been up here alone for 6 years. Only go down to town twice a year for supplies. Don't much care for people anymore. Then why? Because not caring for people and letting them get beaten to death in the street are different things. He turned to face her, and his expression was hard. I won't apologize for how I live, but I won't stand by and watch a woman die when I can stop it. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. What happens now? When the snow clears? That's up to you. I can take you back down to town if that's what you want, or I can take you to the next settlement over the ridge. There's a mining camp there, about 15 miles. You could work there, save money for a passage east. He paused. Or you can stay here till spring. Help me around the cabin. I'll teach you what you need to know to survive up here. And then? Then you decide what kind of life you want. It was more than anyone had offered her in years, more than she'd expected from this hard, scarred stranger who'd pulled her out of the mud and carried her into the mountains. I don't understand you, Eliza said softly. You live alone. You don't like people. But you risked yourself for me. You brought me to your home. Why? Boone was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to the window and stared out at the falling snow. I had a family once, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wife, 2 daughters. Lived on a homestead about 40 miles east of here. He was silent again, and when he continued, the words came slowly, painfully. Came back from a hunting trip one day and found them dead. Raiders had come through, killed my wife, took my girls. Liza's breath caught in her throat. Tracked those men for 3 months, Boone continued. Found them in a camp across the territorial line. Found what was left of my daughters. His hand on the window frame clenched into a fist. Killed every last one of them, 12 men. Didn't matter that some begged. Didn't matter that some ran. Killed them all the same. The law didn't care about a homesteader's family way out here, but they cared about 12 dead men, even if they were murderers and worse. He turned from the window, and his eyes were like ice. So I came here. Been here ever since. Figured I'd live out whatever time I had left away from people, away from everything. But you came back down, Eliza said. You went to town. Needed supplies. Was going to head back up before the first snow. He gestured toward the window. Then I saw you get off that stage. Saw the way Pike looked at you, like you were a thing he'd bought, not a person. His jaw tightened. Seen that look before. Knew where it led. Eliza stood slowly, her legs still unsteady. She moved closer to Boone, close enough to see the network of scars that marked his face and neck, close enough to see the gray threading through his dark hair. Your daughters, she said quietly. How old were they? 8 and 6. His voice cracked on the numbers. Sarah and Margaret. Sarah had hair like wheat in summer. Margaret was small for her age, but fierce as a wildcat. I'm sorry. Nothing to be sorry for. Wasn't your doing. He moved away from her, putting distance between them again. But that's why I couldn't walk past you. Couldn't let Pike... He stopped, his hands clenching and unclenching. You reminded me of my wife. That first day she came west, young and scared and trying so hard to be brave. They stood in silence, the weight of his confession settling between them like fresh snow. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cabin something had shifted. They were no longer quite strangers. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Boone was up before dawn each morning, building up the fire, checking the horses in the lean-to shelter attached to the cabin, melting snow for water. Eliza would wake to find breakfast already made, usually cornmeal mush or fried salt pork, simple but filling. At first she tried to stay out of his way, unsure of what he expected from her. But the cabin was small, and staying out of someone's way in such close quarters was impossible. So she began to help. She washed the dishes after meals. She swept the floor. She organized the supplies on the shelves, finding a system that made sense to her seamstress's mind. Boone watched her work but said nothing. He was a man of few words, she was learning. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Eliza woke to silence, the first real silence since arriving. She pushed open the shutters to find the world transformed. Snow covered everything in a pristine white blanket at least 4 feet deep. The pass Boone had mentioned was completely invisible, buried beneath an avalanche of white. We're truly trapped now, she said, half to herself. Trapped is one word for it, Boone replied from behind her. Safe is another. He was right, Eliza realized. Whatever threat Pike represented, whatever dangers waited in the world below, they couldn't reach her here. Not through this snow, not for months. I want to learn, she said, turning to face him. You said you'd teach me to survive up here. I want to start. Boone studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, get dressed warm. We'll start with the basics. The basics, it turned out, involved snowshoes. Boone pulled 2 pairs from a peg on the wall, one enormous, clearly his own, and another smaller pair that must have belonged to his wife. The thought made Eliza's chest tighten, but she said nothing as he showed her how to strap them on. Walking in snowshoes was harder than it looked. She fell 3 times in the first 10 minutes, floundering in the deep snow like a turtle on its back. But each time, Boone pulled her up without comment, without judgment, and she tried again. By the end of the first hour, she could walk without falling. By the end of the second, she could almost keep pace with Boone's longer stride. He took her to the lean-to first, showing her how to care for the horses. A mare and a gelding, both sturdy mountain breeds. He taught her how to check their hooves for ice, how to measure their feed, how to read their behavior for signs of illness or distress. Up here, horses aren't luxury, he explained, his hand gentle on the mare's neck. They're survival. You take care of them, they take care of you. Next came wood gathering. Even with the storm past, more snow would come, Boone explained. They needed to keep the supply stocked. He showed her which trees to cut from, dead ones, dried enough to burn clean, and how to use the axe without taking off her own foot. Eliza's first attempts were clumsy, the axe feeling impossibly heavy in her soft city hands. But Boone stood behind her, adjusting her grip, showing her how to let the weight of the blade do the work. Don't fight it, he said, his hands over hers on the handle. Work with it. Let it fall where it wants to fall. His touch was impersonal, instructive, but Eliza felt her cheeks heat anyway. She focused on the tree, on the rhythm of the swing, on anything but the feeling of his solid presence at her back. By the time they returned to the cabin, her arms were shaking with exhaustion and her hands were blistered despite the gloves Boone had given her. But she'd cut down a small dead pine, and the pride she felt as they dragged it back was out of all proportion to the accomplishment. That night, as they sat by the fire, Boone pulled out a whetstone and began sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was oddly soothing. You did good today, he said without looking up. It was the first real praise he'd given her, and Eliza felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Thank you for teaching me, she replied. Teaching you is teaching you to stay alive. That's not something to thank someone for. That's just common sense. But despite his gruff words, Eliza thought she detected something in his voice. Satisfaction, maybe, or approval. It was hard to tell with Boone. He kept his emotions locked down tight, visible only in fleeting glimpses. The days turned into a week, then two. The rhythm of cabin life became familiar, even comfortable. Eliza learned to read the weather by the clouds, to track animals by their prints in the snow, to shoot Boone's rifle with something approaching accuracy. The rifle lesson had been her idea. She'd watched him clean his weapons one evening, 2 rifles, a pistol, and several knives of various sizes, and asked if he would teach her. Boone had looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You ever fire a gun before?" "No." "You understand what it means? To point a weapon at something living and pull the trigger?" "I understand that Pike would have killed me if you hadn't been there," Eliza said quietly. "I understand that I never want to be helpless like that again." Something shifted in Boone's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. He stood and took down one of the rifles. "All right then. Tomorrow morning, we'll start." The first time Eliza fired the rifle, the recoil knocked her flat on her back in the snow. Boone helped her up, his expression neutral, and handed her the gun again. "Brace better this time. Let your body absorb it." She fired again, and again. By the end of the lesson, her shoulder was bruised purple and her ears were ringing, but she could hit a tree trunk from 50 paces more often than not. "You're a natural," Boone said, and the surprise in his voice made Eliza laugh. "Or I'm just stubborn." "Same thing up here." They walked back to the cabin in the fading afternoon light, and for the first time since arriving, Eliza felt something like hope stirring in her chest. She was learning. She was getting stronger. She was becoming someone who could survive in this harsh, beautiful place. That evening, as she mended one of Boone's shirts by the firelight, the seamstress in her unable to stand the sight of torn fabric, she found herself studying him. He sat in his usual chair carving something from a piece of pine. His hands were steady despite their size, his movements precise and patient. "What are you making?" she asked. He held it up. A small bird, delicate and detailed, every feather carved with loving care. "A wren," he said. "Margaret loved wrens. Used to watch them for hours." Eliza's throat tightened. "It's beautiful." "It's just wood." But he set it carefully on the shelf with several others, a deer, a wolf, a rabbit, a whole menagerie of memories, carved in the long, lonely years of his exile. "You must miss them terribly," Eliza said softly. "Every day." Boone picked up another piece of wood and began a new carving. "But the pain's different now, duller, like an old wound that aches when the weather changes but doesn't bleed anymore." "Do you think that's wrong, that the pain fades?" Used to think if I let the pain go, I'd be letting them go too." His knife moved steadily against the wood. "But I figure they wouldn't want me to hurt forever. Sarah, especially. She was always telling me not to be sad." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Eliza sewing and Boone carving. The fire crackled and popped, and outside an owl called in the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said finally. "Can't stop you." "Why do you have women's clothes here and the smaller snowshoes?" Boone's hand stilled on his carving. "When I first came up here, I thought maybe I'd bring them back. My wife and girls. Thought maybe I could make a new life for us, away from everything." He set down the knife and stared into the fire. "Bought the clothes and shoes in town, hauled them all the way up here. Then I realized how crazy that was. They were gone. No amount of wishing would bring them back." "But you kept the things." "Couldn't seem to get rid of them. Told myself I'd use them for trade goods eventually. Never did." He looked at Eliza then, really looked at her. "Guess they were just waiting for someone who needed them." The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Then Boone stood abruptly and moved to the window. "Getting colder. I'll bring in more wood." He was gone before Eliza could respond, leaving her alone with the firelight and her thoughts. She understood what he'd just told her, what he'd admitted without quite saying it outright. She was wearing his dead wife's clothes, using her things, filling a space that had been empty for 6 years. It should have felt wrong. Should have felt like she was replacing someone irreplaceable. But somehow it didn't. It felt like something coming full circle, like these things that had waited unused for so long had finally found their purpose. December came, bringing with it colder temperatures and more snow. Eliza marked the days on a piece of bark Boone gave her, scratching a line for each one that passed. She'd been on the mountain for 4 weeks now, and the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach felt like a stranger. Her hands were no longer soft. They were calloused and rough, marked with small cuts and burns from cooking and work. Her body was stronger too, muscles she'd never known she had developing from hauling water and wood, from walking in snowshoes, from the constant physical demands of mountain life. But it was more than just physical changes. Something inside her had shifted too. The fear that had lived in her chest for so long, fear of men, of violence, of what the future might hold, had quieted. Not gone, maybe never truly gone, but muted. Boone was part of that, she knew. Despite his size, despite his scars and his rough manner, he'd never once made her feel threatened. He kept his distance, slept on his pallet by the door, even though she'd offered to take turns with the bed. He was unfailingly respectful, almost painfully so. Sometimes Eliza wondered if he saw her as a person at all, or just as a responsibility he'd taken on. But then she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she'd wonder if maybe, possibly, he felt the same confusing tangle of emotions that she did. One evening in mid-December, Eliza decided to make something special for dinner. Boone had shot a wild turkey the day before, and she'd found dried apples and some precious cinnamon in his supplies. She spent the afternoon preparing a feast: roasted turkey, apple compote, biscuits made from their dwindling flour stores. When Boone came in from checking the horses, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "What's all this?" "Dinner," Eliza said, suddenly nervous. I wanted to make something nice. To thank you. For everything." Boone removed his coat slowly, his eyes still on the laden table. "You don't need to thank me." "I know. I wanted to." They sat down to eat, and for the first time the meal felt like more than just fuel. It felt like a celebration, like a marking of something important, even if neither of them could quite name what that something was. "This is good," Boone said after his first bite. "Really good. Haven't had cooking like this since—" He stopped abruptly. "Since your wife?" He nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Tell me about her," Eliza said gently. "If you want to." Boone was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then slowly, he began to talk. About how he'd met Anna, about their courtship and marriage, about the homestead they'd built together. His voice was rough with emotion, but he kept going and Eliza listened without interrupting. "She was strong," he said finally. "Stronger than she looked. Had to be, to survive out here. But she was gentle, too. Kind. Made our place feel like a real home, not just a house." "I'm sure she'd be proud of what you've survived," Eliza said softly. "I'm not sure about that." Boone pushed his plate away. "I killed 12 men, Eliza, hunted them down like animals and shot them dead. Some of them probably had families of their own. They murdered your family. Does that make it right? Does revenge bring anyone back?" Eliza thought about Pike, about the way his hand had felt twisted in her hair, about the boot swinging toward her ribs. "I don't know if it makes it right, but I understand why you did it, and I don't think less of you for it." Boone looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Understanding, acceptance, the recognition of two people who'd both survived things they shouldn't have had to survive. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd be terrified of me, someone who'd leave the first chance they got." He leaned back in his chair. "But you're still here." "I have nowhere else to go." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Eliza could feel her heart beating faster, could feel the heat rising to her cheeks. "No," she admitted. "It's not the only reason." Before Boone could respond, a sound cut through the night, a long, wavering howl that made the hair on Eliza's arms stand up. "Wolves," Boone said, already moving toward the window. "Big pack from the sound of it." More howls joined the first, a chorus of wild voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. Eliza moved to stand beside Boone, peering out into the darkness. She could see nothing but snow and trees and shadows, but the howling continued, closer now. "Are we safe?" she asked. In here, yes. But the horses. Boone grabbed his rifle and his coat. Stay inside, bar the door behind me. I'm coming with you. No, it's too dangerous. You taught me to shoot for a reason, Eliza said, already pulling on her own coat and reaching for the second rifle. I'm coming. For a moment she thought Boone would argue. Then he nodded sharply and handed her ammunition. Stay close. Don't fire unless I tell you to. They stepped out into the freezing night, and the howling seemed to intensify, as if the wolves knew humans had entered their domain. The moon was nearly full, casting blue shadows across the snow. Boone moved toward the lean-to with Eliza right behind him, both rifles ready. The horses were panicking, their eyes rolling white with terror. And just beyond the fence line, Eliza could see them, shapes moving in the darkness, eyes reflecting the moonlight like scattered emeralds. There's at least 15, Boone said quietly. Maybe more. They're hungry, desperate. One of the wolves moved closer, a huge gray beast that looked more like a legend than a living animal. It watched them with an intelligence that was almost human, weighing its chances, calculating the risk. Boone raised his rifle and fired into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the mountains, and the wolves scattered back into the trees. But they didn't leave. Eliza could still see them circling, still hear their low growls and huffing breaths. They're not giving up, she said. No, they're too hungry. Boone fired again, this time at the big gray wolf. The bullet kicked up snow inches from its feet, and the animal snarled but held its ground. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the pack attacked. They came from 3 directions at once, coordinated and vicious. Boone's rifle barked once, twice, and 2 wolves fell. But the others kept coming, leaping over their fallen packmates without hesitation. Fire! Boone shouted. Eliza raised her rifle and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she'd braced for it this time. A wolf yelped and tumbled into the snow, and she was already reloading, her hands moving on pure instinct and training. Boone fired again and again, his movements calm and precise even as the wolves closed in. One leaped at him, jaws wide, and he swung his rifle like a club, catching the animal in midair and sending it crashing to the ground. Eliza fired at a wolf charging the fence where the horses screamed in terror. The animal fell and she reloaded again, her breath coming in harsh gasps, her hands shaking. The big gray wolf was still there, still watching. It hadn't joined the attack, had simply observed while its packmates died. Now it growled low in its throat, and the remaining wolves, 5, maybe 6, backed away slowly. Boone kept his rifle trained on the gray. Go on, he said quietly. Take what's left and go. We don't want to kill you all. For a long moment, the wolf stared at them. Then it turned and loped into the trees, and the rest of the pack followed, dragging 2 of their dead with them. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the harsh breathing of the horses and Eliza's racing heart. She lowered her rifle with trembling hands and stared at the dark shapes in the snow. 3 wolves they'd killed, their blood black in the moonlight. You all right? Boone asked. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd just killed living things, had aimed a weapon and ended lives. The reality of it was hitting her now, making her stomach churn. Boone seemed to understand. He took her rifle gently and leaned both weapons against the cabin wall. Then he put his hand on her shoulder, solid and grounding. You did good, he said. Saved the horses. Maybe saved us too. That took courage. I don't feel courageous, Eliza whispered. I feel sick. That's how you know you're still human. The day killing doesn't affect you is the day you've lost something important. His hand squeezed her shoulder once. Come on, let's get back inside. I'll deal with the bodies in the morning. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Eliza's legs felt weak, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking, but she'd done it. When the moment came, when she had to choose between freezing in fear or fighting back, she'd fought, and she'd survived. Inside, Boone built up the fire and made strong tea. They sat in their usual chairs, neither speaking, processing what had just happened. The howling had stopped completely. The wolves had learned their lesson, at least for tonight. Thank you, Boone said finally, for coming with me, for not panicking. Thank you for teaching me how to shoot. Eliza managed a weak smile. Turns out it was useful. Most things worth learning usually are. They finished their tea in comfortable silence, and when Eliza finally stood to go to bed, Boone stopped her with a question. Earlier, before the wolves, you said you're still here for more than one reason. What did you mean? Eliza turned back to face him. In the firelight, his scars seemed softer somehow, less like marks of violence and more like a map of survival. His eyes held hers, patient and questioning. I meant that I feel safer here than I felt anywhere, she said honestly. I meant that you've shown me more kindness and respect than any man I've ever known. And I meant that when I think about spring, about leaving here, it doesn't feel like freedom anymore. It feels like loss. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Boone stood slowly, and for a moment Eliza thought he might cross the space between them, might touch her again the way he had outside. But he stayed where he was, his hands at his sides. I know what you mean, he said quietly. This cabin's been empty a long time. Now it feels full again, and I'm not sure I want to go back to empty. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But it was honest, and for now, that was enough. Eliza climbed into bed with her heart full of confused emotions, fear from the wolf attack, pride in her own courage, and something warm and frightening that she didn't quite dare name. Outside, the mountain settled into winter silence, and in the cabin, two broken people continued the slow, careful process of healing each other without either of them quite realizing it was happening. Christmas came to the mountain on a morning so clear and cold that the air itself seemed to crack with every breath. Eliza woke to find Boone already up, as always, but this time he was doing something different. He dragged a small pine tree into the cabin and was securing it in a corner with rocks and rope. What are you doing? She asked, sitting up in bed. Boone looked almost embarrassed, which was startling on a man who usually showed so little emotion. It's Christmas Eve. Thought you might like a tree. Eliza's throat tightened. She'd lost track of the days, hadn't realized the holiday was upon them. Back east, Christmas had been a time of forced cheer in boarding houses, of watching families celebrate while she sat alone. But here, in this remote cabin with this quiet man, the simple gesture of a pine tree felt like the most precious gift she'd ever received. It's perfect, she whispered. They spent the morning decorating it with whatever they could find. Eliza cut strips of red fabric from an old shirt and tied them into bows. Boone carved small ornaments from scraps of wood. By afternoon, the tree stood proud in the corner, humble but beautiful, filling the cabin with the scent of fresh pine. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Boone pulled something from his coat pocket and held it out to her. It was one of his carvings, a wren, delicate and perfect, its tiny wings spread as if caught mid-flight. For you, he said gruffly. Merry Christmas. Eliza took it with trembling hands, running her fingers over the intricate featherwork, the careful details. Boone, I don't have anything for you. Yes, you do. He gestured around the cabin, at the organized shelves, the mended clothes, hanging from pegs, the curtains she'd sewn from spare cloth to cover the windows. You've given this place life again. That's gift enough. She wanted to say something, wanted to express the tangle of emotions in her chest, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she stood and moved to where he sat, and before she could second-guess herself, she leaned down and kissed his scarred cheek. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Boone went very still. When Eliza pulled back, his hand came up slowly and touched the place where her lips had been, as if he couldn't quite believe it had happened. Eliza, he started, his voice rough. But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by a sound from outside, the sharp crack of a branch breaking under weight. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting. It was too deliberate, too loud to be an animal. Boone was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with his rifle. Eliza grabbed her own weapon, her heart hammering. The wolves hadn't returned since that night 2 weeks ago. This was something else. See anything? She whispered. Not yet. Boone's eyes scanned the tree line, his body tense. Could be nothing. Could be a deer. But the way he gripped his rifle said he didn't believe that. Eliza moved to the other window, peering out into the fading light. The sun was setting early, as it did this time of year, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. There. Movement at the edge of the clearing, a flash of dark fabric against the white. Boone, she breathed. Someone's out there. He was beside her in an instant, following her gaze. Then his whole body went rigid. Get away from the window, now! The urgency in his voice made Eliza obey without question. She backed toward the center of the cabin, her rifle raised, as Boone moved to bar the door. How many? She asked. At least 3. Maybe more. He positioned himself at the window, using the wall for cover. They're trying to stay hidden, but the snow makes that hard. Who are they? Boone's jaw clenched. Only one man would come up here in winter. Only one man stupid and mean enough to try. Pike. The name hung unspoken between them, heavy with dread. A voice called out from the trees, confirming Boone's suspicion. Caleb Boone! I know you're in there. Send out my property, and maybe I'll let you live. Eliza felt ice flood her veins. Pike had found them. Despite the snow, despite the impassable trails, somehow he'd tracked them to this remote cabin. You got no property here, Pike, Boone shouted back. Just 2 people who want to be left alone. That woman cost me $60. She's mine by law, and I mean to collect. There's no law says you can buy a person. She don't belong to you. A different voice joined Pike's, deeper, with the lazy drawl of authority. Now, Caleb, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The lady signed a contract. Mr. Pike here has rights. That you, Sheriff Mason? Boone called. Didn't know you made house calls this far out. Special circumstances. Mr. Pike's a prominent citizen. When he asks for help recovering stolen property, I'm obliged to assist. Eliza moved closer to Boone, keeping low. He brought the law, she whispered. What do we do? That ain't law. That's corruption wearing a badge. Boone's eyes never left the tree line. Mason's been in Pike's pocket for years. Everyone in town knows it. How many men does he have? Can't tell yet, but Pike wouldn't come up here without enough guns to feel safe. He glanced at her. You remember what I taught you about staying calm under pressure? Eliza nodded, trying to slow her racing heart. Good, because we're about to need it. Pike's voice rang out again. I'm giving you 1 minute, Boone. Send her out, or we're coming in. Come ahead, Boone shouted. But know that the first man through that door gets a bullet. Silence fell over the clearing. Eliza counted heartbeats, trying to steady her breathing. 30 seconds. 45. Then the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the stillness. The window beside Boone exploded inward, showering them both with glass and splinters. He returned fire instantly, his rifle barking twice in rapid succession. Someone screamed in the trees. Get down! Boone grabbed Eliza and pulled her behind the heavy table, which he tipped on its side to create a barrier. More shots rang out, punching holes in the cabin walls, sending wood chips flying. How many? Eliza gasped, raising her own rifle. 6, maybe 7. Boone was reloading with practiced speed. They've got us surrounded, north and west sides for sure. What about the lean-to? Can we get to the horses? Not without getting shot. He peered around the edge of the table and fired again. We're pinned down. The attack intensified. Bullets hammered the cabin from multiple directions, a deadly rain of lead that seemed designed more to terrify than to kill. They were trying to break their nerve, Eliza realized, trying to make them panic and surrender. They're wasting ammunition, she called over the noise. Why? Because they're not trying to hit us yet, Boone replied grimly. They're softening us up. When they think we're scared enough, they'll rush the door. As if on cue, the shooting stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, Pike's voice carried clearly. You can't win this, Boone. We've got more men, more guns, more ammunition. Send out the girl, and we'll leave you in peace. Don't believe him, Eliza said quietly. He'll kill us both. I know. Boone met her eyes. Listen to me. There's a back way out of here. Small opening behind the woodpile leads to a crawl space under the cabin. You can follow it to an exit about 20 yards into the trees. I'm not leaving you. Eliza, no! She grabbed his arm. You didn't leave me in Dry Creek, and I won't leave you now. We fight together or we die together. Something fierce and proud flashed in Boone's eyes. All right then, together. He handed her extra ammunition. We need to change the situation. Right now they've got all the advantages. We need to take one away. How? Boone looked around the cabin, his mind clearly working. Then his gaze settled on the fireplace, and a slow, dangerous smile crossed his scarred face. "The ridge," he said. "About half a mile north. Remember I showed it to you, the narrow pass?" Eliza nodded. She remembered. A choke point where the mountain path squeezed between two walls of stone, with a steep drop on one side and a loose rock face on the other. "If we can get there, we can defend it. One person with a rifle can hold off a dozen men in a space that tight." "But how do we get there? They're watching the door." "We don't use the door." Boone moved to the fireplace and kicked aside the burning logs, smothering them with snow from a bucket. Smoke billowed, but beneath it, Eliza could see what he was doing. The fireplace was large, built for serious mountain winters, and its opening was big enough for a person to climb through. "The chimney?" "Comes out on the roof. From there we can drop to the lean-to, get the horses, and make a run for it. They'll see us the moment we're on the roof. Not if we give them something else to look at." Boone grabbed one of the oil lamps and smashed it against the far wall. The fuel splashed across the wood, and he followed it with a second lamp. "When this place goes up, they'll be too busy watching it burn to watch the roof." "You're going to burn your cabin?" "It's just wood and nails, Eliza. We're flesh and blood. I know which one matters more." He struck a match, holding it ready. "You go first. Climb fast and stay low. I'll be right behind you." Eliza looked at the soot-stained chimney, then at Boone, then at the door where Pike and his men waited to kill them both. She thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach, frightened, beaten, helpless. That woman would have frozen with fear. But that woman was gone. She slung her rifle across her back and climbed into the fireplace. The stone was still warm from the fire, and the chimney was narrow, but she'd grown stronger these past months. Her arms and legs found purchase, and she began to climb. The ascent seemed to take forever. Her shoulders scraped against rough stone, and soot rained down into her eyes and mouth. But she kept climbing, driven by the knowledge that Boone was waiting below, that any second Pike's men might rush the door. Her hand found empty air, the top of the chimney. She pulled herself out onto the roof and immediately dropped flat, making herself as small a target as possible. The roof's slope was steep, covered in snow and ice, treacherous as a knife edge. Below, she heard Boone moving. Then came the whoosh of flames catching, and orange light flickered through the cabin's windows. "Fire!" someone shouted from the trees. "The cabin's burning!" Men emerged from cover, drawn by the spectacle like moths to flame. Eliza counted 5, 6, 7 of them, spread out around the clearing. And there, in the center, unmistakable even in the fading light, stood Harlan Pike. Boone emerged from the chimney beside her, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. He had both rifles and what looked like most of their ammunition strapped to his back. "The lean-to," he breathed. "On 3. 1, 2. They slid down the roof together, using the snow as a lubricant, building speed. Eliza's stomach lurched as they hit the edge and launched into empty air. For one heart-stopping moment, she was flying, weightless, the ground rushing up to meet her. She landed in deep snow beside the lean-to, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Beside her, Boone hit and rolled, coming up already moving toward the horses. "They're on the roof!" Pike's voice, sharp with fury. "Shoot them!" Bullets zinged through the air, but in the confusion and the smoke from the burning cabin, the shots went wide. Boone had the horses untied in seconds, and he threw Eliza onto the mare before mounting the gelding himself. "Ride!" he shouted. "North! Don't stop for anything!" They exploded from the lean-to at a full gallop, the horses' hooves throwing up great gouts of snow. Behind them, men shouted and guns roared, but the darkness was their ally now, and the horses knew these trails better than any human. Eliza clung to the mare's mane, her rifle banging against her back, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Trees flew past in a blur. The trail climbed steeply, winding between massive pines and jutting rocks. More shots echoed through the night, closer than before. Pike's men were mounting their own horses, giving chase. Eliza risked a glance back and saw lights bobbing in the darkness. Torches, at least 5 of them, strung out in pursuit. "They're following," she called to Boone. "Good! That's what we want!" He urged his horse faster, taking a sharp turn that nearly unseated Eliza. "We lead them to the ridge. It's our only chance." The chase became a nightmare race through the frozen forest. Branches whipped at Eliza's face and arms. The mare stumbled over hidden roots but kept going, driven by terror and training. Behind them, the pursuit continued, relentless as a nightmare. The trail grew narrower, steeper. The horses labored now, their breath coming in great plumes of white steam. Eliza's thighs ached from gripping the mare's sides, and her hands were numb on the reins. Then, suddenly, they were there. The trail opened onto a narrow ridge, exactly as Eliza remembered. To the left, solid mountain. To the right, a drop into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. And ahead, perhaps 30 yards of path so narrow that two horses couldn't walk abreast. Boone dismounted and slapped his gelding's hindquarters, sending it running ahead through the pass. He did the same to Eliza's mare, then grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a tumble of boulders at the mouth of the pass. "Here! This is where we make our stand!" They'd barely reached cover when the first of Pike's men came into view. The rider saw them and opened fire, but Boone's answering shot took him clean from the saddle. The man fell screaming into the darkness beyond the trail's edge. The other riders pulled up short, confronted with the reality of the situation. The narrow pass created a bottleneck. They couldn't spread out, couldn't flank, couldn't use their superior numbers. They could only come at Boone and Eliza head-on, one or two at a time, directly into the muzzles of their rifles. "Give it up, Boone," Pike's voice echoed off the rocks. He was still back in the trees, Eliza noted, sending his men ahead while he stayed safe. "You're outnumbered. You can't win." "Then come and prove it," Boone shouted back. "Stop sending other men to die for you and face me yourself." A long silence. Then Pike rode forward slowly, his horse picking its way carefully over the rocky ground. As he came into the light of his men's torches, Eliza saw he'd brought Sheriff Mason with him, the lawman's badge glinting dully. But there was someone else too, a third man, sitting straight and watchful on a gray horse, wearing a long coat and a flat-brimmed hat. As he moved closer, Eliza saw the star on his chest. Not a sheriff's tin, but the five-pointed star of a federal marshal. Boone saw him too, and his posture changed subtly. "Marshal Kane," he called. "Didn't expect to see you up here." "Been tracking Mr. Pike for 3 weeks now," the marshal replied, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Imagine my surprise when the good sheriff here insisted on leading me straight to him." Pike twisted in his saddle. "What are you talking about? I'm the victim here. That woman belongs to me." "That woman doesn't belong to anyone, Mr. Pike. Slavery ended a while back, case you missed the news." Marshal Kane pulled a folded paper from his coat. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you're wanted for murder, fraud, and kidnapping in 3 territories. Been using that mail-order bride scheme to lure women out here for years, haven't you? Some you sold, some you killed, some just disappeared." "That's a lie!" Pike's face had gone pale. "Sheriff, tell him!" But Mason was already backing his horse away, his hands raised. "I got nothing to do with any of that, Marshal. I was just doing my civic duty, helping a citizen." "You were helping a criminal," Kane interrupted. "And you'll answer for that too. Now, Mr. Pike, you can come quietly, or we can do this the hard way." For a moment, Pike just sat there, his expression blank with shock. Then his hand moved toward his gun. "Don't!" Boone's rifle came up instantly, but Pike was past reason, past caring. His gun cleared leather, swinging toward the marshal, and Eliza saw his finger tighten on the trigger. She fired without thinking, without hesitation. Her bullet took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. His own shot went wild, ricocheting off rocks. Before anyone could react, Pike recovered with desperate speed and grabbed for Eliza, who'd stood up from behind the boulder without realizing it. His hand locked around her wrist like an iron band, yanking her off balance. "Let her go!" Boone roared, but he couldn't shoot, not with Eliza directly in his line of fire. Pike dragged her backward toward the edge of the trail, toward the darkness and the drop. His gun pressed cold and hard against her temple. "Drop your weapons," Pike screamed. "All of you! Or I blow her brains out right here." Eliza's mind raced. She could feel the void behind her, the empty air where the trail ended and the fall began. Pike's grip on her wrist was crushing, and the gun barrel felt huge and deadly against her skin. "Think about what you're doing, Pike," Marshal Kane said calmly. "You shoot her, you got no leverage, no way out." "I got no way out anyway!" Pike's voice cracked with panic and rage. "You're gonna hang me. Might as well take someone with me." Eliza's eyes found Boone. He stood frozen, his rifle useless in his hands, his face a mask of anguish. She saw him calculating, searching for an opening, but Pike had positioned them too well. In that moment, Eliza understood that this was it. The moment that would define everything. She could wait for someone to save her, or she could save herself. She remembered the wolf attack, remembered the feeling of pulling the trigger, of fighting for her life. She remembered every lesson Boone had taught her about survival, about refusing to be helpless. She stopped struggling. Pike, surprised by her sudden stillness, loosened his grip slightly. Just a fraction, just enough. Eliza threw her weight backward, directly into Pike, driving her elbow into his wounded shoulder with every ounce of strength she possessed. Pike screamed and his gun arm jerked away from her head. In that half second of freedom, Eliza tore herself from his grasp and threw herself forward, away from the edge, toward safety. Pike staggered, his balance gone, his boots sliding on the icy trail. He windmilled his arms, trying to recover, but momentum and gravity had their hooks in him now. Boone's knife flashed in the torchlight, spinning end over end through the air. It struck Pike dead center in the chest, the force of it driving him the final step backward. For a moment, Harlan Pike stood on the very edge of the abyss, his eyes wide with the knowledge of what was coming. Then he fell, soundlessly at first, then screaming, a sound that echoed off the rocks and faded slowly into the distance until there was nothing left but silence. Eliza collapsed to her knees, shaking so hard she thought she might fly apart. Then Boone was there, his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe. He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." Around them, Pike's men were surrendering to the marshal, their weapons clattering to the ground. Sheriff Mason sat on his horse with his hands behind his head, already wearing shackles. Marshal Kane approached carefully, his hands visible and empty. "That was quite something," he said, looking at Eliza with respect. "Most folks would have frozen." "She's not most folks," Boone said quietly, still holding her. The marshal nodded. "I'll need statements from both of you, and there'll be some paperwork about Pike's death. But given the circumstances, I don't imagine any charges will be filed." He glanced at the edge where Pike had fallen. Man made his own choices. Died by them, too. "What about the cabin?" Eliza asked, her voice muffled against Boone's coat. "We burned it down." "I saw that. Sorry about your home, Boone." "Just a building," Boone replied. "We'll build another one." The casualness of that "we" sent warmth through Eliza's chest, cutting through the shock and fear. We. As if it was decided, as if there was never any question that they'd be together when this was over. Marshal Kane organized Pike's surviving men into a line and began the process of securing them for the long trip down the mountain. It would be dawn before they could safely navigate the trail, he explained, so they'd make camp here for the night. Boone retrieved his horses and led Eliza to a sheltered spot away from the prisoners. He built a small fire and wrapped her in every blanket he had, then sat beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers. "You fought back," he said after a while. "When Pike grabbed you. You didn't wait for rescue." "You taught me that," Eliza replied. "You taught me to save myself." "No, that was already in you. I just reminded you it was there." He took her hand, his scarred fingers gentle. "You were incredibly brave tonight." "I was terrified." "Brave doesn't mean not scared. It means scared and doing it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "When he had that gun to your head, I thought, I couldn't lose you. Not after finally finding something worth—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Worth what?" Eliza prompted softly. "Worth living for again." Boone turned to face her fully, and in his ice-blue eyes she saw vulnerability, hope, fear. "These months with you, you've brought me back from a place I thought I'd never leave. Made me remember what it feels like to care about tomorrow instead of just surviving today." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "I care about tomorrow too, about all the tomorrows we might have. Even without a cabin? Even starting from nothing again?" "We're not starting from nothing." She squeezed his hand. "We have each other. And we have these mountains, and we know how to survive. That's more than nothing. That's everything." Boone smiled then, a real smile that transformed his harsh features into something almost gentle. "Then we'll build again. Better this time. A real home. not just a place to hide from the world. Together, Eliza said. Together, Boone agreed. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear winter sky. Somewhere below them, the remains of the cabin still smoldered, sending up thin trails of smoke. But Eliza felt no regret for its loss. It had served its purpose, had sheltered them through the winter, had been the chrysalis where two broken people began to heal. The real home, she understood now, wasn't made of logs and stone. It was made of trust and courage and the slow, careful building of something new from the wreckage of the past. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally claimed her, Eliza leaned her head on Boone's shoulder and closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving the East, she felt certain of her future, certain of her choice, certain of the man beside her and the life they would build together in these wild, beautiful mountains. The danger had passed. The monster was dead. And tomorrow, when the sun rose on the first day of their new beginning, they would face it together, stronger for the battle they'd survived, ready for whatever came next. Dawn broke over the ridge in shades of pink and gold, painting the snow with colors so vivid they seemed unreal. Eliza stirred from her half-sleep to find Boone already awake, his eyes on the horizon, one hand resting protectively on the rifle across his knees. He looked tired, his face drawn with the weight of a sleepless night, but when he noticed her watching him, something soft entered his expression. "How'd you sleep?" he asked quietly. "Better than I should have, considering." Eliza sat up, her body stiff and aching from the previous night's ordeal. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" Someone needed to keep watch. He gestured toward where Marshal Kane's camp was stirring to life, the prisoners being roused and prepared for the long descent. "Can't be too careful, even with Pike dead." The mention of Pike's name should have brought fear, but instead Eliza felt only a hollow sense of closure. The man who'd beaten her, who'd claimed to own her, who'd hunted her through the mountains, he was gone. Not arrested, not escaped, but truly, permanently gone. Marshal Kane approached their fire, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Morning, folks. We'll be heading down soon as the light's good enough. I'd appreciate it if you'd ride with us, at least part way. Need those statements while everything's fresh." "What about the cabin?" Eliza asked. "Should we check if anything survived?" The marshal shook his head grimly. "Sent 2 men at first light. Place burned to the foundation. Nothing left but ash and stone." "I'm sorry." Boone's expression didn't change. "Like I said, just a building. Things can be replaced." "Still, losing your home right before winter." Kane pulled out a leather pouch and counted out several gold coins. "This is from Pike's bounty. Not the full amount. That gets divided among the territories that filed charges. But it's enough to get you through till spring. Buy supplies, maybe rent a place in town." "We're not going to town," Boone said flatly. "Boone, be reasonable. You got no shelter up here now. The lady can't spend the winter in a tent." "We'll manage." Boone's tone left no room for argument. "These mountains have kept me alive for 6 years. They'll keep us both alive now." Eliza touched his arm gently. "Maybe we should at least consider—" "No." He turned to her, his eyes fierce. "I know what happens when people like us go back to town. The talk, the judgment. They'll say you're living in sin, that I took advantage. They'll try to separate us, put you in some boarding house where proper ladies can teach you proper ways." His voice roughened. "I won't go back to that. Won't watch another woman I care about get destroyed by people who think they know better." The raw honesty in his words made Eliza's chest tight. Another woman he cared about. The parallel to his late wife was clear, but it didn't hurt the way she might have expected. Instead, it felt like an honor to be placed in the same category as the woman he'd loved enough to spend 6 years mourning. "Then we don't go to town," she said simply. "We stay on the mountain." Marshal Kane sighed but nodded. "Your choice. But take the money anyway. You earned it, and winter's hard enough without being broke too." Boone hesitated, pride warring with practicality, then accepted the coins. "Appreciate it." They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, turning the snow to blinding white. The descent was slow and treacherous, the horses picking their way carefully over ice-slicked rocks. Eliza rode beside Boone with the marshal and his prisoners spread out in a line ahead and behind them. As they traveled, Kane rode up alongside them and cleared his throat. "There's something you should know about Pike, about what we found when we searched his ranch. What did you find? Eliza asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Records, letters. He'd been running this scheme for almost 8 years. We found correspondence with 43 different women. The marshal's voice was heavy. Only 17 are accounted for. The rest, we're still looking. Eliza felt sick. 43 women, all answering advertisements just like she had, desperate for a new start, for protection, for hope. And Pike had used that desperation against them. The 17 who survived, she asked quietly. Where are they now? Some married other men in town. Some left the territory entirely. A few... He paused. A few ended up in brothels in the mining camps. Couldn't find honest work after Pike was done with them. What'll happen to them now? To all of them? The court will contact the known survivors, offer restitution from Pike's estate. It's not much, but it's something. Kane looked at her with understanding. You could file a claim too. You're entitled. I don't want his money, Eliza said firmly. Give my share to the others, the ones who have nothing. The marshal nodded approvingly. That's generous of you, ma'am. I'll make sure it's done. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds, the crunch of snow under hooves and the creak of saddle leather. Then Boone spoke, his voice thoughtful. The women in the mining camps, the ones working in brothels, they have a choice now. Can leave if they want? In theory, but most have nowhere to go, no skills, no money. They're trapped as surely as if they were in chains. Boone exchanged a glance with Eliza, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd both been trapped once, both been given a chance to escape. How could they not offer the same to others? When we build our new cabin, Boone said slowly, we'll build it bigger than the last one, with extra rooms. If any of those women want to come learn how to survive on the mountain, learn a trade, have a safe place while they figure out their next step, they're welcome. The marshal looked surprised, then impressed. That's quite an offer. You sure you want to take that on? We're sure, Eliza said, warmth flooding her chest. This was who Boone was beneath the scars and the silence. A man who'd help anyone who needed it, who understood what it meant to be broken and need sanctuary. By midday, they'd reached the point where the trail split. One path led down to Dry Creek, the other toward the mining settlement Boone had mentioned. The marshal would take his prisoners down to Dry Creek, he explained, where proper cells and judges waited. This is where we part ways, Boone said, reining in his horse. Kane extended his hand and Boone shook it firmly. You're good people, the marshal said. Both of you. The territory needs more like you. The territory's welcome to stay down there while we stay up here, Boone replied. But there was no heat in his words, just finality. The marshal tipped his hat to Eliza. Ma'am, if you ever need help, official help, you send word. After what you did last night, standing up to Pike like that, you've got friends in the marshal's service. Thank you, Eliza said, but I think I've got all the protection I need right here. She meant Boone, but as she looked at the rifle across her saddle, at her own capable hands on the reins, she realized she also meant herself. She wasn't the helpless woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach anymore. She'd become someone who could protect herself, who could fight, who could survive. They watched the marshal's group disappear down the mountain trail, then turned their horses north, back toward the high country. The silence of the wilderness closed around them like a welcoming embrace. So, Eliza said after a while, where do we go now? The cabin's gone. There's an old trapper's shelter about 3 miles from where the cabin was. Not much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it'll keep us dry while we figure out what's next. Boone shifted in his saddle. Or we could head to the mining camp, get a room at the boarding house, wait out the worst of winter in comfort. Could we do that? After what you said to the marshal? Could. Doesn't mean we should. He looked at her seriously. What do you want, Eliza? Really want? Not what you think I want to hear, the truth. Eliza considered the question as they rode. She could picture the boarding house, warm beds, cooked meals, human company. After months of isolation, part of her craved those things. But she also pictured the stares, the whispered conversations, the judgment in the eyes of proper women who'd never had to make the choices she'd made. I want to stay on the mountain, she said finally. I want to see what we can build together, without anyone watching or judging or telling us we're doing it wrong. And yes, It'll be harder than staying in town. But nothing worth having comes easy, does it? Boone's answering smile was like sunrise. No, it doesn't. The trapper's shelter turned out to be even more primitive than Boone had suggested. It was little more than a lean-to with 3 walls and a partial roof, chinked with mud and moss that had mostly fallen out. But it had a stone hearth that still worked, and it was positioned in a natural windbreak that provided some protection from the elements. "Home sweet home," Boone said dryly as they dismounted. Eliza laughed despite herself. "Well, it's better than nothing, and at least it didn't burn down. Give it time." They spent the remainder of the afternoon making the shelter livable. Boone cut fresh pine boughs to fill the gaps in the walls, while Eliza gathered stones to repair the hearth. By sunset, they had a fire going, and the space was almost cozy in a rough frontier way. That night, they ate a simple meal of salt pork and hardtack from Boone's saddlebags, and afterward, as they sat by the fire, Eliza found herself studying him. In the flickering light, his scars seemed to soften, becoming just part of the landscape of his face rather than marks of violence. "What are you thinking?" Boone asked, catching her stare. "That I'm grateful," Eliza said honestly, "for all of it, even the hard parts, because they brought me here, to this moment, with you." Boone was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers gentle around hers. "I need to tell you something. Need to say it before we go any further." Eliza's heart quickened. "All right. When I brought you up here, I told myself it was just about keeping you safe, that once winter ended, you'd go your own way and I'd go back to being alone." He stared into the fire. "But that was a lie. I knew from the first night watching you sleep by the fire that I didn't want you to leave, and that terrified me." "Why did it terrify you?" "Because caring about someone means you can lose them. And I've lost everyone I ever cared about, my parents to fever, my wife and daughters to violence. For 6 years, I've been safe from that pain because I haven't let myself care about anyone." His grip on her hand tightened. "Then you came along. And all those walls I built, they just crumbled." Eliza moved closer until their shoulders touched. "I'm scared too. Every man I've known before you has hurt me in some way. My father, my employers, Pike. I learned to expect pain from men, to protect myself by never trusting, never hoping. But you trusted me." "Not at first. At first I was just too tired and hurt to resist. But then I started to see who you really were. Not the scars or the reputation, the man who carved birds for his dead daughter, who taught me to survive instead of just keeping me helpless and dependent, who burned his own home to save my life." She turned to face him fully. "That's the man I trust. That's the man I—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. It was too soon, surely. Too fast to feel what she was feeling. But Boone finished the sentence for her, his voice rough with emotion. "The man you love?" "Yes," Eliza whispered. "Is that crazy? After only a few months?" "If it is, then we're both crazy." He cupped her face in his large, scarred hand. "Because I love you too, Eliza Rowan. Didn't plan to. Didn't want to. But there it is, big as the mountain and just as unmovable." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she were made of glass. But Eliza didn't want gentle. She'd been handled gently by people who meant her harm, had learned that softness could hide cruelty. What she wanted was Boone's honesty, his strength, his absolute certainty. She kissed him back fiercely, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer. He responded with a sound halfway between a groan and a laugh, his arms coming around her, solid and warm and safe. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Boone rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably talk about what happens next, about the future." "Right now?" "Well, maybe not right now." He smiled and it transformed his entire face. "But soon, because if we're going to do this, really do this, we need to do it right." "What does right look like?" "Marriage. Proper marriage, with a preacher and witnesses. I won't have people calling you my kept woman or saying I took advantage." His expression turned serious. "You deserve better than that. Deserve better than me, truth be told, but I'm selfish enough to hope you'll settle anyway." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "Is this a proposal?" "Worst proposal in the history of the world, probably. I don't have a ring. We're sitting in a half-collapsed shack in the middle of nowhere. I can't even get down on one knee because of this damn leg I injured years back. He took both her hands in his. But yes, it's a proposal. Marry me, Eliza. Help me build a life worth living. Have a future with me in these mountains. Yes, Eliza said, the word coming out choked with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. He kissed her again, cutting off her words. And for a while there was nothing but the warmth of the fire and the warmth of each other, two broken people becoming something whole. Later, as they lay wrapped in blankets with Boone's arms around her, Eliza stared up at the stars visible through the gaps in the roof and tried to comprehend how her life had changed. 3 months ago, she'd been desperate and alone, climbing onto a stagecoach toward an uncertain future. Now she was engaged to a man who loved her, planning a life in the wilderness, feeling more certain of herself than she ever had. "What are you thinking now?" Boone murmured against her hair. "That I'm happy, truly, completely happy. Is that allowed? After everything that's happened?" "Not only allowed, deserved." He pulled her closer. "We've both earned some happiness, I think." They fell asleep like that, tangled together against the cold. And when morning came, they woke to fresh snow falling through the broken roof and the dawning realization that they had a lot of work to do. The next weeks were a blur of constant labor. They couldn't rebuild the cabin. Not yet, not in the deepest part of winter. But they could reinforce the shelter, make it weathertight, create a space that would keep them alive until spring. Boone worked from dawn to dusk, cutting logs and sealing walls, while Eliza managed their supplies, cooked, and kept the fire going. In the evenings, they planned their future. The new cabin would be larger, Boone explained, sketching designs in the dirt by firelight. Not just for the women who might come seeking refuge, though that was part of it, but for the family he hoped they'd have someday. "I'm not young anymore," he said, a trace of uncertainty in his voice. "And I don't know if I'll be a good father after losing my girls. But I'd like to try. If you want children." Eliza thought about it, about what it would mean to bring a child into this harsh world. But she also thought about raising that child with Boone, teaching them to be strong and kind and unafraid. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." As January turned to February, the weather began to shift. The worst of the winter storms had passed, and though it was still bitterly cold, there were days of clear sky and bright sun that hinted at the spring to come. On one such day, Boone announced they were going to town. "I thought we weren't going back to Dry Creek," Eliza said, surprised. "Not Dry Creek. The mining camp. We need supplies, and we need a preacher." He looked at her seriously. "Unless you've changed your mind about marrying me." "Never. But are you sure? You hate towns." "I hate what towns represent. All the pettiness and judgment and cruelty dressed up as civilization." He took her hand. "But I love you more than I hate towns, and I want to do this right." The mining camp was called Silver Ridge, and it clung to the mountainside like a barnacle to a ship's hull, rough, ugly, but stubbornly alive. They rode in on a cold morning in late February, and the streets were busy with miners and merchants, with women in worn dresses and children playing in the muddy streets. Boone led them to a general store, where he used some of Marshall Kane's bounty money to buy supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, nails, tools, the basics they'd need to start building come spring. The proprietor, a grizzled man with one eye, gave Boone a respectful nod. "Heard about what happened with Pike," he said. "Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say. Man was a devil." "You know of any women who worked for him?" Boone asked. "Ones who might be looking for a fresh start?" The proprietor's expression turned cautious. "Might be. Why?" "Because we're offering one. Clean work, safe place, chance to learn a trade. No strings attached." Word spread quickly in a small camp like Silver Ridge. By the time Boone and Eliza had finished their shopping, 3 women had gathered outside the store, their faces hopeful and suspicious in equal measure. The oldest couldn't have been more than 30, though hard living made her look older. She stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "This some kind of trick? Because if you're recruiting for another house, you can save your breath." "No trick," Eliza said gently. "We're building a homestead up in the high country. When it's finished, there'll be room for anyone who wants to learn how to live independent. Sewing, cooking, hunting, trapping, whatever skills you need to make your own way. And what do you get out of it? Another woman asked, her eyes narrow with distrust. Help building the place, Boone said, and the satisfaction of knowing we did something good. That's all. The women exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, the oldest spoke again. When would we start? Spring. Soon as the snow melts enough to build. We'll send word when we're ready. It wasn't a commitment, not yet, but it was a beginning. The women promised to think about it, to ask around, to see if others might be interested. As they dispersed back into the camp, Eliza felt a sense of purpose settling over her. This was what they were meant to do, not just survive, but help others survive too. They found the preacher in a tent church at the edge of camp. He was a young man, earnest and enthusiastic, who agreed immediately to perform the ceremony. But when Boone tried to schedule it for that day, the preacher balked. Today? But there's no time to prepare, no flowers, no witnesses, no— Don't need any of that, Boone interrupted. Just need the words that make it legal. The preacher looked to Eliza for support. Ma'am, surely you want a proper wedding? Eliza thought about proper weddings, the ones she'd seen in her youth, with their finery and formality, their empty promises and loveless unions. Then she looked at Boone, at his scarred face and steady eyes, and knew exactly what she wanted. I want to marry this man, she said firmly. Today. Right now. Everything else is just decoration. The preacher sighed but capitulated. He rounded up 2 miners to serve as witnesses, both drunk but good-natured, and within an hour Eliza and Boone stood before him in the tent church with its dirt floor and canvas roof. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, and Eliza tried to focus on the words, on the solemnity of the moment, but all she could really focus on was Boone's hand holding hers, warm and solid and real. When it came time for vows, the preacher prompted Boone first. Do you, Caleb Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Boone said, his voice steady and sure. And do you, Eliza Rowan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Eliza interrupted, unable to wait for the rest of the words. The preacher blinked, then smiled. Well then, by the power vested in me by the territory and the grace of the Almighty, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Boone pulled Eliza into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the enthusiastic applause of their drunken witnesses. When they finally broke apart, the preacher was holding out a marriage certificate, freshly inked and official. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Boone, he said warmly. May you have many happy years together. They rode out of Silver Ridge that afternoon as the sun was setting, married and provisioned, ready to face whatever came next. The shelter awaited them, humble but warm, and beyond it, the promise of spring and new beginnings. That night, lying in each other's arms, Eliza traced the scars on Boone's chest and thought about all the pain that had brought them to this moment, his losses and hers, the violence and fear and desperate choices. None of it had been fair or right or just. But somehow, impossibly, it had led them here. What are you thinking? Boone asked, the question that had become a ritual between them. That I'm Mrs. Caleb Boone now. That I have a husband who loves me. That we're going to build something beautiful in these mountains. She looked up at him, and that despite everything, despite Pike and the pain and all the terrible things that happened, I wouldn't change any of it, because it brought me to you. Boone's arms tightened around her. I know what you mean. I spent 6 years wishing I could go back and change the past. But if I did, I might not have been in Dry Creek that day. Might not have seen you step off that stage. And then where would we both be? Lost, Eliza whispered. Still lost and broken and alone. But we're not anymore. We found each other, and tomorrow we start building the life we both deserve. Outside, the wind sang through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood eternal and unmoved, witness to their vows and their love, ready to shelter them through whatever trials lay ahead. And in the small shelter with its warm fire and shared blankets, 2 people who'd been thrown away by the world held each other close and dreamed of the future they would build together, stronger, braver, and more whole than either had ever been alone. Spring came to the mountain like a whispered promise, tentative at first, then bolder with each passing day. The snow began to melt in earnest by mid-March, creating rivers of ice-cold water that carved new paths down the slopes. Eliza stood outside the shelter one morning and heard a sound she'd almost forgotten. Birdsong, clear and sweet, announcing that the worst was finally over. "Ready to start building?" Boone asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Eliza leaned back against his solid warmth and smiled. "I've been ready since the day we got married." They'd spent the last weeks of winter planning every detail of the new cabin. It would sit on a different site than the old one, higher up, with better drainage and a clear view of the approaches, so they'd never be surprised again. The design was ambitious, with a main room, 2 smaller bedrooms, and a loft that could sleep several people. Large windows would let in light, and a proper stone fireplace would keep them warm through the coldest months. "It's going to take months," Boone cautioned, "maybe the whole summer." "Then we'd better get started." The first task was clearing the site. Together they removed rocks and stumps, leveling the ground with tools Boone had brought from town. The work was backbreaking, and Eliza's hands blistered despite the calluses she'd developed over the winter. But every evening, as they surveyed their progress, she felt a fierce pride growing in her chest. This was theirs, built by their own hands, earned through their own sweat. In early April, as the snow retreated further up the mountain, they heard horses approaching. Boone reached for his rifle instinctively, but Eliza touched his arm, calming him. Something told her this wasn't danger. She was right. 3 women rode into the clearing, the same ones they'd met in Silver Ridge. The oldest dismounted first, her expression cautious but determined. "Name's Ruth," she said. "Ruth Henderson. You said to come when we were ready." "Well, we're ready." The other 2 introduced themselves as Mary and Jane, both younger, both carrying the same guarded hope in their eyes. They'd brought what little they owned in saddlebags and bedrolls, and they looked at the cleared site with something like wonder. "There's not much yet," Eliza said, suddenly worried they'd be disappointed. "Just the shelter, and it's cramped for 2, let alone 5. "It's more than we had," Ruth replied simply. "We're not afraid of hard work. Just tell us what needs doing." What followed was a transformation that exceeded anything Eliza had imagined. With 5 sets of hands instead of 2, the work progressed at an astonishing pace. Ruth turned out to be skilled with an axe, her strokes precise and powerful despite her small frame. Mary had grown up on a farm and knew carpentry, while Jane had a gift for organization that kept their supplies and tools in perfect order. The women slept in the shelter while Boone and Eliza made do with a tent they'd purchased in Silver Ridge. It wasn't comfortable, but it was temporary, and the sound of women's laughter around the evening fire made up for any discomfort. One night, as they all sat around the fire eating dinner, Ruth looked at Boone with curiosity. "Why are you doing this, really? Most men, they want something from women like us. But you're different." Boone was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was rough with memory. "I had daughters once. Lost them young. And I've been thinking, wondering, what kind of men they would have met if they'd lived. Would those men have helped them when they needed it? Or would they have used them up and thrown them away?" He looked at Ruth directly. "I can't save my girls, but maybe I can help save someone else's daughters, someone else's sisters. Maybe that counts for something." Ruth's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It counts for everything, Mr. Boone." By May, the cabin's frame stood complete, a skeleton of strong timber that rose against the mountain sky like a promise taking solid form. They worked on the walls next, fitting logs together with careful precision, chinking the gaps with moss and mud. Eliza taught the women the techniques Boone had taught her, and soon they were working as a coordinated team, each person knowing their role without needing to be told. In the evenings, after the work was done, Eliza began teaching the women other skills. She showed them how to sew proper seams, how to read patterns, how to turn scraps of fabric into useful garments they could sell. Mary taught everyone her carpentry techniques, while Ruth shared her knowledge of wilderness survival, skills she'd learned the hard way during her own difficult journey west. Boone taught them all to shoot, patiently correcting their stances, praising their progress. Jane turned out to be a natural, her shots clustering tight even at distance. "Never thought I'd be good at anything," she said wonderingly, staring at the target she'd hit dead center. You're good at lots of things, Eliza told her. You just never had the chance to find out before. As spring turned to summer, more women began to arrive. Word had spread through the mining camps and settlements carried by merchants and travelers. They came in pairs and alone, some on horseback and some on foot, all carrying the same mixture of hope and wariness. Some stayed only a few weeks before moving on, newly confident and skilled enough to make their own way. Others settled in for the long term, finding in the mountain community something they'd never had before: safety, purpose, belonging. By late June, the main cabin was finished. It stood proud and solid, with glass windows they'd hauled up from Silver Ridge and a door that locked from the inside. The women decorated it with wildflowers and hung curtains Eliza had sewn, transforming raw wood into a real home. The night they moved in, Eliza stood in the main room and felt tears streaming down her face. Boone found her there, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and held her as she cried. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. "Nothing. Everything's perfect. She turned in his arms to face him. "I never thought I could have this. A real home. A husband who loves me. People I care about who care about me back. It's too much, too good. You deserve good things, Eliza. We all do." He kissed her forehead. "And we're just getting started." He was right. With the main cabin complete, they began work on additional structures: a barn for the horses and the small herd of goats they'd purchased, a smokehouse for preserving meat, a workshop where the women could practice their crafts and produce goods to sell. The work was endless, but it was also joyful. They sang while they built, told stories around the evening fire, celebrated small victories, and supported each other through setbacks. The community was growing into something organic and beautiful, a place where broken things could heal and new dreams could take root. In August, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but when she woke one morning feeling violently ill, she knew for certain. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She was going to be a mother. She and Boone were going to have a child. She told him that evening, pulling him aside after dinner to whisper the news. For a moment, Boone just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face crumpled, and he pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice choked. "I'm sure." "A baby." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with tears. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. He laughed, the sound raw and wondering. Terrified, too. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't? "You'll be wonderful," Eliza interrupted firmly. "I've seen you with the women here, how patient you are, how kind. You're already good at this." The news spread through their little community like wildfire, and the women threw themselves into preparing for the baby's arrival with enthusiasm that touched Eliza deeply. Ruth began knitting tiny blankets and clothes. Mary built a beautiful cradle from pine. Jane organized the supplies they'd need, making lists and checking them twice. "It's like the baby already belongs to all of us," Mary said one evening, her hands busy with needlework. "Maybe that's how it should be," Eliza replied. "A whole community raising a child together. That seems right, doesn't it?" As summer faded into autumn, their homestead continued to grow and thrive. They now had 12 women living on the mountain permanently, with others coming and going as they learned skills and found their paths. Some had taken up trapping and were earning good money selling furs. Others had become skilled seamstresses, their work sought after in the mining camps. A few had even started teaching, passing on their knowledge to other women who needed it. One crisp October morning, Marshal Kane rode up the mountain with an unexpected visitor. Eliza was hanging laundry when she saw them approach, and her heart skipped a beat until she recognized the marshal's familiar form. "Mrs. Boone," Kane called, dismounting. "Hope we're not intruding." "Never," Eliza replied, though her eyes were on his companion, a well-dressed woman of about 40, sitting straight in her saddle with an air of authority. The woman dismounted gracefully and extended her hand. "Mrs. Boone, I'm Eleanor Morrison. I represent a charitable organization back east that supports education and opportunities for women. The marshal has told me remarkable things about what you're building here." Over tea in the main cabin, with Boone and several of the other women present, Eleanor explained her purpose. Her organization wanted to help fund their efforts, she said. They could provide money for supplies, tools, and books. They could help establish formal apprenticeship programs, connect the women with markets for their goods, even arrange for a teacher to come help those who wanted to learn reading and writing. "What do you want in return?" Ruth asked suspiciously. "Nothing but your success," Eleanor replied. "We believe women deserve the same opportunities as men. What you're doing here, creating a place where women can learn independence and self-sufficiency, it's exactly the kind of work we want to support." Boone had been quiet throughout the conversation, but now he spoke up. "We're not interested in becoming some kind of charity case. These women have their pride. I'm not offering charity, Mr. Boone. I'm offering partnership. You provide the vision and the work. We provide resources to help you succeed faster and reach more women." Eleanor looked around the table. "But the decision is yours. All of yours." The women discussed it late into the night after Eleanor and the marshal had left. Some were skeptical, worried about strings attached or losing control of what they'd built. Others saw the potential, the chance to help even more women than they could reach alone. In the end, they voted to accept the partnership, but on their terms. Eleanor's organization could provide funding and connections, but all decisions about the homestead would remain with the women who lived there. It was their home, their community, their future. Winter came again, but this time it felt different. The new cabin was warm and weather-tight, their stores were well-stocked, and they had a community to support each other through the dark months. Eliza's pregnancy progressed, her belly growing round beneath her dresses. Boone treated her like she was made of glass, hovering anxiously until she finally told him to stop. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she said with exasperation. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my women," Boone replied stubbornly. "Not while I have anything to say about it." His protectiveness was annoying and endearing in equal measure, and Eliza found herself falling in love with him all over again every time she caught him building something special for the baby or reading books about childbirth that he'd ordered from back east. Christmas came, and they celebrated together as a family. The cabin was decorated with pine boughs and hand-carved ornaments, and they sang carols that echoed off the mountain walls. Eliza received gifts from everyone: tiny clothes for the baby, a rocking chair Boone had built in secret, a quilt pieced together by all the women, each square representing a different person's contribution to their community. "This is what family looks like," Ruth said, raising a cup of cider and toast. "Not just blood, but choice, choosing to care for each other, to build something together. That's real family." They all drank to that, their voices rising in agreement, and Eliza felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. This was everything she'd never dared to hope for: love, safety, purpose, belonging. And it was real. It was hers. The baby came on a snowy night in late January, just over a year since Eliza had first arrived on the mountain. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Eliza feared she wouldn't survive it. But Ruth had assisted in dozens of births, and she guided Eliza through each contraction with steady confidence. Boone paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal, unable to sit still, jumping at every sound. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountain, a baby's cry pierced the air. Ruth opened the door, her face exhausted but jubilant. "You have a son, Mr. Boone. A healthy, beautiful son." Boone was in the room before she finished speaking. He knelt beside the bed where Eliza lay, pale and sweaty, but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in Ruth's knitted blanket. His son. Their son. "He's perfect," Boone whispered, his voice breaking. "You're perfect, both of you." Eliza placed the baby in his arms, and Boone held his son with a gentleness that belied his size and scarred hands. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he looked at the tiny life they'd created, the promise of a future he'd thought lost forever. "What should we name him?" Eliza asked softly. Boone thought for a moment, looking down at his son's wrinkled red face, the tiny fists waving in the air. "Thomas," he said finally. "After my father. Thomas Caleb Boone." "Thomas," Eliza repeated, testing the name. "I like it." "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to your family." The women took turns visiting throughout the day, each one bringing small gifts and cooing over the new arrival. By evening, Eliza was exhausted but content, watching Boone rock their son in the cradle Mary had built, singing a lullaby in his rough voice. "Are you happy?" she asked, the question he'd asked her so many times before. Boone looked up, and his smile was like sunrise. "I didn't think I could feel this again, this hope, this joy, this sense that the future is something to look forward to instead of something to endure." He came to sit beside her on the bed, still holding Thomas. "You gave me that, Eliza. You and our boy and this life we've built. You gave me everything." "We gave it to each other," Eliza corrected gently. "Neither of us could have done this alone." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Thomas grew from a tiny newborn into a plump, happy baby who was spoiled by an entire community of adoring women. He learned to smile, to laugh, to recognize faces. And Boone transformed from the hard, isolated man Eliza had first met into a father who carried his son everywhere, who sang to him and talked to him and clearly couldn't imagine life without him. The homestead continued to flourish. With Eleanor Morrison's organization providing support, they established formal programs that attracted women from across the territory. They taught skills, provided shelter, connected women with opportunities. Some stayed permanently, becoming part of the extended family. Others moved on to build their own lives, but they stayed in touch, writing letters and visiting when they could. By the time Thomas celebrated his first birthday, their small community had helped over 50 women find new paths. Some had married, choosing partners who respected them as equals. Others had started businesses or claimed homesteads of their own. A few had even gone back east to pursue education, armed with skills and confidence they'd gained on the mountain. One warm afternoon in late summer, Eliza stood on the porch Boone had built, watching him play with Thomas in the grass. Their son was walking now, tottering around on unsteady legs while his father followed close behind, ready to catch him if he fell. Ruth came to stand beside her, her own weathered face soft with affection as she watched them. "You've built something beautiful here, Eliza, something that's going to last long after we're all gone." "We built it," Eliza corrected, "all of us together." "Maybe, but you and Boone, you started it. You took your own pain and turned it into something that helps others heal. That takes courage." Eliza thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach, beaten, terrified, certain her life was over. She thought about the long winter in the cabin, learning to be strong, learning to trust. She thought about the fire and the chase and the moment she'd broken free from Pike's grip and chosen to fight for her own life. All of it had led here, to this porch, this view, this life. To a husband who loved her and a son who made her heart feel too big for her chest. To a community of women who'd become sisters, who supported each other and built each other up instead of tearing each other down. "I used to think survival was enough," Eliza said quietly. "Just getting through each day, enduring whatever came. But that's not living. This," she gestured at the scene before her, at the cabins and workshops, at the garden where women were harvesting vegetables, at Boone swinging Thomas up onto his shoulders to the baby's delighted shrieks. "This is living. This is what I was surviving for, even when I didn't know it." That evening, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle and the other women had retired to their cabins, Eliza and Boone sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and another answered. "Do you ever miss it?" Boone asked. "The life you might have had? Civilization, cities, society?" Eliza considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if things had gone differently. If I'd never gotten on that stagecoach, never met Pike, never came here." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "But then I look at what we have, and I can't imagine choosing anything else. This is real. This is true. Everything else was just pretending to live while being slowly crushed by other people's expectations." "I know what you mean." Boone squeezed her hand. "I spent 6 years up here alone thinking isolation was the same as safety, but it wasn't. It was just another kind of death, slow and cold. You taught me that living requires risk, requires opening yourself up to the possibility of pain because that's the only way to experience joy." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who'd learned to communicate as much through quiet presence as through words. Then Boone spoke again, his voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about expanding, building more cabins, taking in more women. Eleanor's organization wants to help establish places like this in other territories. They're asking if I'd be willing to train other men to do what we've done here. What did you tell them? That I'd think about it, that I'd talk to you. He turned to face her. It would mean travel, being away from here sometimes, from you and Thomas. But it would also mean helping more people, creating more places where women can be safe and learn to be strong. Eliza smiled. I think we should do it. Thomas is still small, but in a few years we could take him with us sometimes. Show him that the world is bigger than just this mountain. Teach him that helping others is the most important work there is. You're sure? It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder. We've learned that lesson well enough, haven't we? Boone kissed the top of her head. That we have. The autumn that followed was one of preparation and transition. They trained several of the women to take leadership roles in the homestead, ensuring the community could run smoothly even when Boone and Eliza were away. Ruth became the unofficial head of the household, her combination of toughness and compassion making her perfect for the role. Mary oversaw all the building projects, while Jane managed supplies and finances with meticulous care. In October, Boone made his first trip to help establish a similar community in a neighboring territory. He was gone for 3 weeks, and Eliza missed him fiercely, but she also felt pride knowing what he was doing. When he returned, full of stories about the women he'd met and the progress they'd made, she saw in his eyes the same sense of purpose she felt herself. They fell into a new rhythm over the following months and years. Boone would travel for a few weeks several times a year, while Eliza managed the homestead and cared for Thomas. When their son was old enough, they began taking him along on shorter trips, letting him see the wider world and understand the work his parents were doing. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who was equally comfortable with an axe or a book, who treated everyone with the same respect regardless of their past or position. He learned from his father how to hunt and track, how to build and repair. He learned from his mother how to sew and cook, how to read and write. And he learned from all the women on the mountain that strength came in many forms, that courage meant different things to different people, and that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. By the time Thomas was 5, there were 7 homesteads like theirs scattered across the territory, each one a haven for women seeking new lives. They'd helped hundreds of women, and the word was spreading even further. Eleanor's organization was expanding nationally, using their model as a template for communities across the country. One spring morning, as Eliza worked in the garden with Thomas playing nearby, a rider came up the mountain path. She shaded her eyes against the sun, trying to make out who it was, and then her breath caught. It was a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sitting awkwardly on a horse that was clearly too much for her to handle. Her dress was torn and muddy, and even from a distance, Eliza could see the bruises on her face. She looked exactly like Eliza had looked all those years ago, lost, hurt, desperate. Eliza set down her gardening tools and walked to meet her, Boone emerging from the workshop to join her. The girl dismounted clumsily, nearly falling, and stood before them with her chin raised in defiant hope. I heard there was a place up here, she said, her voice shaking. A place where women could be safe, where they could learn to be strong. Is that true? Eliza looked at Boone, and they shared a smile full of understanding and purpose. This was what they'd built, this moment, repeated over and over, each woman finding her way to safety and strength. It's true, Eliza said gently, stepping forward to take the girl's hand. You're safe now. Come with me. As she led the young woman toward the main cabin, explaining about the community and the programs and the possibilities, Eliza felt the circle completing itself. She'd been this girl once, stepping off a stagecoach into hell. Someone had saved her. Now she spent her life saving others. That evening, after the new arrival had been fed and settled and welcomed by the other women, Eliza stood once more on the porch with Boone, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their home. Thomas was asleep inside, tired from a full day of play and learning. Around them, the community they'd built hummed with quiet life, laughter from one cabin, the sound of someone singing in another, the smell of bread baking. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? Eliza asked. In Dry Creek, when everything seemed hopeless? Boone thought back, his brow furrowing. Come with me. 3 words. That's all it took to change everything. 3 words that saved my life and led to all of this. It wasn't just the words, Boone said softly. It was you. Your courage to accept help when it was offered. Your strength to keep going when things got hard. Your vision to see that we could build something bigger than just our own survival. Eliza turned to face him, this man who'd given her so much. Love, safety, purpose, family. His face was more weathered now, more gray in his dark hair, but his eyes were the same pale blue that had first made her feel safe in a world of danger. We did it together, she said. Everything we've accomplished, we've done it together. And I wouldn't change a single moment, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones, because they made us who we are. Boone pulled her into his arms, and they stood there as darkness fell, 2 people who'd been thrown away by the world and had responded by building something beautiful from the scraps of their broken lives. They'd turned pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, isolation into community. Behind them, through the window, they could see Thomas stirring in his sleep, one small hand reaching out as if searching for comfort even in his dreams. In the other cabins, women who'd arrived with nothing were building new lives, new skills, new confidence. And somewhere down below, in towns and settlements across the territory, other women were hearing about the place in the mountains where second chances were real and hope was more than just a word. The future stretched out before them, unknown and uncertain as futures always were. There would be more challenges, more struggles, more women to help, and lives to rebuild. But Eliza and Boone would face it all together, supported by the family they'd chosen and the community they'd created. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eliza thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. She thought about the journey from that muddy street in Dry Creek to this moment of peace and purpose. And she understood that sometimes the worst moments in life were actually doorways to the best ones, if you had the courage to walk through them. She'd walked through. They both had. And on the other side, they'd found everything they'd never dared to dream of, love that lasted, purpose that fulfilled, and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their transformation, shelter for their dreams. And in the cabin behind them, their son slept peacefully, growing up in a world his parents had fought to make kinder, safer, better. This was what victory looked like. Not dramatic or flashy, but quiet and real and lasting. 2 broken people who'd refused to stay broken, who'd chosen instead to heal each other and then to help others heal too. The moon rose, full and bright, casting silver light across the homestead. And Eliza and Boone stood together in its glow, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, certain only of each other and the unshakable knowledge that love, real, hard-won, honest love, could overcome anything. Their story had begun with 3 simple words in the mud and darkness. It had grown through winter hardship and spring hope, through violence survived and peace earned. And now it continued, not as an ending but as a beginning that would echo through generations, a testament to the truth that even the most broken among us can build something beautiful if we're brave enough to try.